Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our second festival edition of Certified Forgotten. I like this. This is a habit I could get used to, Matt.
Yes, I enjoy this.
Yeah. Usually I don't let you talk so early, so you're confused as the silence. If this is your first time listening to the show, and if you were listening as part of North Bend, congratulations. You found one of the cooler film festivals with a really good lineup this year. We're so glad that you're watching. This is Certified Forgotten. We are a podcast that deals with films that have I already messed up the hand thing, 5 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. So we kind of deal with the stuff in the horror genre that doesn't get noticed. We try and bring a little bit of spotlight to it. It's bad SEO, but it's good for conversation and guests. So we're happy with that. I'm Matt Monagle. I'm an Austin-based film critic. I'm joined as always by this guy. This guy, Matt Donato. How you doing, bud?
Doing good, bud. It is 90 degrees, and I'm probably going to be sweating halfway through this. So I am wearing my Delta by Dude Bro Party Massacre 3 tank top in celebration.
Nice. As we started to record, just remembered we're having potentially rolling blackouts in Texas. So this will be fun. This is going to go fine.
Let's see if we actually make it the whole recording.
Well, if we do, it'll be because we have 2 awesome guests that we're incredibly excited to have to come today and talk about this film. Donato, can you do the introductions, please?
Absolutely. First of all, Mr. Monagle, you're the one that willed this into existence, and we bring to the podcast for the first time, it is a bit of a Switchblade Sisters reunion. We bring Katie Walsh, Tribune News Service, LA Times film critic, Miami Nice podcaster, as well as April Wolfe, Switchblade Sisters writer, and now writer of Black Christmas, and a filmmaker. And we'll just leave that vague for things that come up, and I'm going to bring them into camera right now. I hope they're ready.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you both for coming on. So for those that have listened to the show before, we like to talk about horror history of our guests because everybody has a cool story of kind of how they got started in the genre before it became an obsession and a compulsion. You know, there was that first really fun experience. So for people that didn't have the opportunity to listen to Switchblade Sisters, rest in peace, I'd love to kind of hear both of you talk a little bit about your horror origin stories and kind of where and when you first fell in love with the genre. And I'm going to go clockwise, so I'm going to do April first.
Okay. You guys might hear some purring. My cat's purring very loudly into the mic.
ASMR.
Some
Fan
ASMR.
of the show.
Horror, I think, has just kind of always been a part of my life. I've said it before, but my grandpa, who passed this past October, he raised me for most of my young life, and he was a huge horror fan. The more gore, the better. And he introduced me to some of the classics and also some of the lesser known stuff, deeper cuts that we found at the Rite Aid, which used to rent VHSs when we finally got a VCR. And he introduced me to all of that stuff. His favorite movie was The Ice Cream Man. And I loved him dearly and kind of just wanted to emulate him. And I really didn't think about how much that influenced me until later on when I was in my 20s and I started watching horror again. And I was just like, I love all this shit. Why did I stop? And just kind of found my way back to it.
Katie, what's your story?
Mine is totally the opposite, which is that my mom was super overprotective. And I actually wrote about this a little bit in my piece about Carrie for Certified Forgotten. And she was very like, you can't watch this. Like she tried to cover my eyes in The River Wild when we were in the theater. I was like 12 and I was like, no way. I kind of like batted her away. But my mom can't handle violence in movies. And so she was always really trying to protect me from that. And I think my sort of desire to seek out horror as a teenager was really sort of because it was rebellious and because it was like something that was like forbidden fruit. And I entered the horror genre through, I remember watching the It miniseries, like at a sleepover, which was very scary to me. And also through kind of like horror adjacent stuff, like Rocky Horror Picture Show was a huge deal for me in like middle school-ish times. And then all the Screams, all the I Know What You Did Last Summer movies were like hugely influential because I was a teenager and I would go to the theater with my friends and we were just like laughing and screaming and yelling at the screen. So really we were horrible little shitheads for doing that, but also it was just that collective experience and that immersive experience of being in a theater and like, interacting with something. So that was really my entry into the genre. And then I became really obsessed with Carrie sort of later on in high school. And like, that was my like favorite movie. And I also think like I studied horror in college, and I made a horror film for my thesis. And then I kind of, after college, like got away from it. And then I definitely came back to it. So I had that kind of same experience as April of kind of leaving it aside for a bit and being like, do I really like this? And then coming back and really feeling like falling in love with the genre again.
Well, I want to ask, because you both kind of that step away thing. Was there anything that kind of made the genre feel like it was in a place where you got more excited about it than maybe you had been in a couple of years? Because I know that like, you know, the mid 2010s, everybody's really excited about mumblegore. There were all these like really cool trends going on, especially in markets like Austin and Los Angeles, where these filmmakers were popping up communities and they were working on really low budget stuff. So for either of you, were there types of films or filmmakers or just kind of overall trends in the industry that made you think like, oh, horror is good. I kind of want to, there's something here that was lacking for a little bit that I want to explore a little bit more.
For me, I know for sure during the torture porn era was when I kind of fell away from the genre. And so I wanted to see more sort of like fun, campy, self-aware. And I do think there are, like, I think Hostel Part 2 is totally fun and campy and self-aware. And I actually love that movie. But I think when it got back to more, I don't know, when it got out of the torture porn genre was when I kind of came back in, I think. I like to have fun.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not alone. I mean, I had that too. I think, and it wasn't a conscious thing. It was just like, oh, these things maybe just don't interest me at all. But it's so funny because Hostel 2 is also one of those touchstones where you're just like, yeah, that's, you know, like no matter what, that's going to be great. There was a certain kind of attitude, a kind of nihilism that I found kind of turned me off post 9/11 stuff for a little while. And so once people felt like they could get that camp back, they could have that fun again in a way that just didn't feel like everything was like just dark. Just nonstop dark, you know. I think I really started like that. But also, I have to say, like around 2004 is around the time when I first saw. Was it around 2004? It must have been 2005 when I first saw May. And when May came out, like on home video, and I was watching that, I think I just kept an eye out for smaller horror filmmakers because, like, it's just like an indie low budget gem that everyone was telling their friends about, and I still see people on, you know, Twitter finding May for the first time, and I think that there was a certain kind of like upcropping of indie filmmakers who were kind of following in Lucky's footsteps after that you just had to like search out. It's just that I didn't know where to search them out. I had no idea.
Yeah, and at the time too, if we're talking about like the early 2000s, just like you said, dark was the buzzword. Like dark and gritty were the buzzwords of every remake, everything that was coming out, and it was the Snyder takeover in a way, and it kind of bled into horror a little bit. And there were still, like you just said, so many of these great indie horror movies that we didn't have the technology at the time to really have the streaming services and the video on demand services to find those films. And you had to go to the Blockbuster or dive in Walmart, and it had such like a negative connotation. So I like to hear that. I think back, and truthfully, I am now discovering a lot of movies I like from the 2000s era, because at the time I didn't watch them because I got turned off by all that stuff. And I spent the 2000s trying to watch like old films that I am still lacking on. Like I tried to do my education when I got into horror in the 2000s. And so like to hear that, like I actually kind of do agree, like that dark and gritty period where everything was just saturated in shadows and it was all really bleak. I know it was a reaction to a lot of the things that happened in the world, but it was a tough period for horror.
There was a kind of, God, it wasn't like a misogyny, but it was like a different kind of like, because there's always been some kind of misogyny in horror. Like it's just like, you know, like it's kind of baked into some of like the earlier classics, and sometimes it's purposeful and sometimes it's not. But there was a certain kind of like male exclusivity that was happening at that time too, that felt like we had stopped thinking about in terms of like the movies that were getting like the budget, like women as any kind of like person or character that was like a halfway, I don't know, it's hard to describe, but there was like, she was no longer kind of cardboard of like some of like the cheaper 80s slashers and things, but also she didn't have a character. So there was just like this weird, like a purgatory of women at that time where nobody knew how to express those characters, and we didn't, like a lot of women weren't getting the budget to make their own movies and that kind of thing yet. So it felt really hard to find the things that I enjoyed and loved.
Yeah. There was definitely like a big budget horror at that time. It was I'm thinking of the Halloween movie that Jessica Biel was in. I can't even remember which one that was, but it was just like taut, glistening torso, like low-rise jeans. Like that was kind of the, sexual objectification of women, but then also like quasi-empower, like trying to make her the heroine, but then kind of like not getting it right. And all I can imagine from that era is just like remake, like big budget, shiny remakes of classics that were like kind of missing the mark for me.
Yeah.
That's a hard one too, because I write a remake column for Bloody Disgusting, so I'm going one by one through all of those movies, and like right. Yeah, so Jessica Biel was in that Texas Chainsaw remake, and that's actually regarded as like it's like one of the highest like beloved ones of all like the remakes of that era. Like that one gets the most love out, and I think next to it like the Friday gets a little bit, and it is interesting to see which are the ones that like really took off.
But does it stand up to today? The Texas Chainsaw.
I was going to say Texas Chainsaw is the next one I'm going to hit because it's like in such hot demand. I keep kind of forgetting it's there, but everyone keeps saying, but Texas Chainsaw is one of the best. I'm like, all right, you all like beat me over the head with it. I really have to go back and revisit it, because I did revisit things like The Hitcher and Friday the 13th. And I think breaking away from that time period, and My Bloody Valentine too, I adore the first My Bloody Valentine, like the original. And then to see what they did with the remake, we all kind of had a period where remakes were coming out like left and right in the mainstream. So something like My Bloody came out, and I think the turnoff factor was just it was a remake. Everyone didn't want to like it for that reason. And going back and revisiting, I'm going to highlight My Bloody Valentine because it's a really nifty thriller. Like it does the ridiculousness of the first movie. I think the first movie having the mining atmosphere a little better, but the remake, what it does with Jensen Ackles and what we're doing with that entire mystery and allure, it actually pulls off another slasher surprise. Like you don't know who the killer is until the end. And I revisit that and I'm like, this thing is so much fun. Like I forgot. I think we all just kind of got turned off by the dark and the gritty. And after a while, we just didn't want to see those remakes at the time. But resurfacing, it's been kind of like illuminating.
Yeah.
There's also like the sense too where we were coming from the 90s and early 2000s where horror was actually being shot on film stock. And I think that film stock is just one of those things where like it felt almost integral to the genre, having things that feel not as crisp necessarily, where there's there's a certain kind of like not knowing, and just like the obviously like even seeing something on VHS sometimes is just like it feels like it enhances what you're watching, just for this particular genre. And so when we had like access to kind of cheaper digital, and all of a sudden everything was being shot on digital, I think it was I remember it being like a shock for me. It was just these don't look like the movies that I'm used to watching and that I had been watching for like decades. And so I think that it was pretty easy for people to dismiss them, not just for them being remakes, but just for the fact that they looked different, and we didn't have the visual vocabulary to even like digest what was on the screen at that time in some ways. So
yeah, and it's, nostalgia works on a 30-year cycle, right? That's kind of the idea, is that the things that you liked when you were 8, 10 years old, when you're 40 years old, suddenly you have enough purchasing power to actually invest in those. So it kind of makes sense that turn of the century horror was in this exploitation space, because that's what 1970s horror would have been. So those people that grew up, the Eli Roths of the world, when they grew up and said, hey, I'm going to make movies, they gravitated towards the stuff that they cut their teeth on when they were a kid.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And, it'll be, now that we're inching towards the 90s as like prime renaissance for filmmakers that grew up in the 90s and were influenced by 90s horror and want to explore elements of 90s horror on film. It'll be interesting to see how, in a few years, we go through that like game of telephone with like 70s exploitation into torture porn in the early 2000s into 2030s horror filmmakers who were raised on that, and kind of see where all of that shakes loose, because it's going to be weird. It's going to be a genre like folding in on itself several times.
Yeah, the Saw revival that I've been seeing happening on Twitter and Letterboxd because of Spiral has been really interesting. I'm like, why is everybody watching all of these? But obviously, I mean, I know why they're watching them, but it's interesting. I don't know. I just think that genre just like doesn't do it for me. And yeah, so that happens. There's tons of subgenres that are not going to do it for everyone.
Yeah, I've got two. There's two that don't do it for me. Nothing I can do about it.
Well, April, earlier you were talking. Oh well, yeah. Now we got to know.
I was going to say, what are those two?
Yeah. What are the two? If you can tell.
I mean, fantasy is real hard for me. Fantasy is real hard. I think I've said this before, because I feel like really alienated from a lot of my friends who are nerds, because I've never was a nerd, you know. I have a lot of nerd friends, and I want to fit in with them. And there's just like, oh yeah, they grew up reading comic books, and they grew up reading like books with like the silliest fantasy titles. And I'm just like, this is real. And I'm like, I respect all of it. I respect all of my D&D friends as well, because like their imaginations are just wild. But it's just something that like makes me fall asleep, and I cannot help it. It's like a narcolepsy of the genre, and I feel awful when that happens. But it's that, and then like hard sci-fi. It's the same. I think it's just like sometimes the world building is just like, so much of the world building, I can't handle it. There's just so many horses, or like space horses, or
you don't want anything with a map in the front of the bug.
Yeah. I was going to say, what is that Martin Starr line from Party Down? Both hard sci-fi and fantasy are bullshit for you.
Yeah.
Yep.
God, I love that character. But yeah, those are my two that I just have a real hard time with. I can get down with anything, but for some reason it's just those two. But if they cross over into a different genre, then I'm just like, oh, sometimes fantasy adventure is good for me. Sometimes fantasy horror works for me. And you know, like I would say Mandy is one of those crossover things for me, where I'm just like, I watch it and I'm like, am I going to be able to hang with it? And I was like, oh, okay, I can hang with it.
The chainsaw fight, you're like, I can hang.
Yeah, there's yeah, exactly. It's combining things that makes everything palatable for me. So yeah.
I agree. I have no interest whatsoever in haunted house movies. They just don't do it for me. But if it's actually a haunted spaceship, then like suddenly I'm 110% over. So sometimes you just need like a fresh coat of paint on something. Yeah. And then you're totally right there, and you're totally interested. Yeah. Well, April, earlier you were talking a little bit about kind of like that period in horror, and the fact that, you know, representation in film for women was not necessarily where it could have ended up. So that feels like a really natural segue to talk a little bit about Switchblade Sisters, because that was a project that you started and then Katie got involved in as well, where you're talking to women filmmakers, writers, directors, actors, you know, about the genre, or really any films a lot of the time, that kind of inspired them. So what was the impetus for that, and how did you decide that this was something that you were like, somebody's got to do it, it's got to be me?
I mean, it was just weird, because it didn't seem like anyone was doing a ton of stuff to emphasize all women in genre. Like, we had a Theory of Film Festival, which shout out to those folks who have been kind of championing women and horror specifically. But for me, you know, Switchblade Sister is about all genre films. So it's like, it's, you know, trying to get people to understand that women want to direct action films, that they want to do like crime noir stuff, you know, like that they want to do like heist movies and that kind of thing. And so I just thought it would be a really great way to kind of feature a lot of these women filmmakers and let people know the kinds of things that they're interested in. Because honestly, like some of the guests that we've had, you know, like even just like high level, sometimes they'll tell me that they came on the show because they wanted this exec that they were meeting with to see how interested they were in a specific genre, because they really want this directing job. Like, it's kind of like proving their credibility, because they get to, you know, wax poetic for almost a full hour on how they would make a movie if they were making, like this action film, like if they were doing Point Break, like, oh, that's interesting, this is how I might do it. And it was kind of like a sneaky way to do that, but also just to talk about genre films and craft. And I love talking about craft, and I love talking about how people made things. And so that was just, it was just a way to get people to remember women filmmakers' names, I guess.
And Katie, you can answer this question too. I'd love to get both of your opinions on it. But I'm kind of curious how you struck that good balance between, industry and film criticism, kind of those twin worlds. Because, when you started it, I think you were at that point better known, April, as a film critic, and you'd written for LA Weekly, RIP, and a bunch of other places for years. And when I started listening to Switchblade Sisters, the thing that really stood out to me is the fact that it was marrying two worlds that really, they don't cross as much as you'd think, like the film history, film criticism world, and like the production worlds. The goal seems to be to move from one to the other, or to like kind of keep those a little bit separated. And yet when you were having guests on, both of you were having guests on, you were having these really detailed and interesting conversations that bridge the gap. People that were like, yeah, well, I studied film forever, so of course I can talk about this stuff. Things that people might forget about that. Or people that have been watching films their whole life and really picked up on intuitive parts of filmmaking because of that. So either of you, I'm curious how you found that balance evolving over time of like history and criticism and production, and both of those working so well for the show.
I mean, I think Katie can go first on this.
I've had a very varied career. I've kind of been Goldilocks in how I got to what I'm doing now. I was a film major in undergrad and made shorts with my friends and worked in the industry. I actually worked at Lionsgate. That was my first job. So I was like I was in the PR department. So I was working on Saw and Hostel Part 2 and all of these movies, and on the publicity for them. And then I went to grad school, and then I, transitioned into full-time writing. The writing was always kind of happening in the background as my side hustle. But I think it's really important for critics and writers to have like varied experiences and to know how a movie is made. Like, I think you need to know how hard it is to make a movie, because then you will realize that every single little indie movie is a miracle because it just got made, even though it is so bad. And I have reviewed so many bad indie movies, but like, I know that someone put all of their like life savings or their heart or their energy into it. And so I think like, you really need to know as a critic, like when to punch down and when to punch up. And I really try to not punch down, and also, recognize that like, hey, you pulled this off and it's terrible, but you did it and it's done, and that's a miracle. So I just think like having a variety of experience really lends to criticism. And then it also will lend to how you talk to filmmakers. And I think that I before I did Switchblade, I had like moderated a ton of Q&As with women filmmakers, and I had interviewed women filmmakers, and like, I tried really hard to not ask them a ton. I didn't try. I remember one time I did several Q&As with Lynn Shelton, and I had asked her, I was very green, and I had asked her like, well, what's it like being a woman in the industry? And like, she was just like, I don't want to talk about, like, stop saying that, So I learned very quickly to like, stop asking that question. Like, what's it like being a woman director? And because they just want you to say, what's it like being a director? And what kind of lens did you use on this? And like, how did you approach the writing? And I think that women want to be asked those questions and want to dig in on craft. So you have to push yourself as an interviewer. I mean, I looked to April, who set such an amazing standard of conversation on Switchblade, that I knew I had to like bring it every single time. I couldn't just show up with like, well, I like this part, what about this? Like, I wanted it to be a fun conversation, but I also wanted it to be rigorously researched and to ask good questions. So you have to push yourself as a podcast host or a moderator or a critic to like know your stuff, I think.
Yeah, I think I had a circuitous path to get to film criticism as well, because like I really wasn't a film critic for very long. My first job was LA Weekly. Before that, I was just kind of volunteering for some sites that didn't pay me just because I wanted to talk about film history and film. It's just like okay, I want to write an essay on Black Girl because I love this movie, and I would just go and research it, and they would be like, great, we need content for the site. But I was working, training to be like a reporter, like outside of the entertainment industry. I was working on crime and social justice stories for outlets. That was kind of my primary thing. And so I was doing a lot of research and like was actually about to go into court reporting and stuff too. But I got a degree in playwriting and was just kind of making stuff on my own for a really long time. I had always really thought that I was going to be a filmmaker, but when I got into criticism, I just thought maybe I can do both, because some of my favorite filmmakers of all time did both. They're like the Paul Schraders of the world who like know how to like, for all his problems.
Minus Facebook. Paul Schrader minus Facebook.
Park Chan-wook was a critic.
Yeah, there's like a whole host of really, really thoughtful people, and those are also my favorite people to listen to commentaries from and Q&As. Like you always want to talk to those people because there's such a deep process behind it, and they've thought about it from all angles. And so I've always kind of thought that I was going to do both. It's just that the industry kind of doesn't allow that you to be critical of things necessarily if they're coming out, like if you are also making films. But I still get to talk about things if I like them, like I only talk about things if I'm just like, oh, I think this is great. Then I will like go through, dissect it, and kind of use my critical eye for good. I'm definitely never going to pan anything publicly again. That's just not where I am. And also that was not my favorite part of the job anyway. It was like, I just wanted to ignore the things I didn't like and let people kind of talk about those if they enjoyed it. But, I'm kind of getting like the best of both worlds. Like if I get asked to write some essays on some new films that I like, then I will probably still do it, even if I'm, making my TV shows and movies.
Yeah. And I like that you were talking about preparation too, because, that's definitely something that stood out, and something I feel guilty about every time I listen to Switchblade Sisters, even the older episodes, is just like, oh, God damn, they prepped. And
I always tell the story, but when I did my first episode of Switchblade and April sent me her Google document, I was like, what the hell? This is so many pages. I was like, oh no, I have to really bring it. But it was a good example, and I was always really well prepared thanks to her example. So I knew I had to, be on top of my stuff as soon as she sent me that Google Doc.
But, in fairness, it was like 14-point font.
Yeah, you got to read it.
But yeah, I had to be able to read it. My eyesight is just really awful. So
yeah, that's true. But yeah, I was impressed at the depth of the research. So I knew that I had to, keep the standards up.
Yeah. There's also like a cool thing too, that when I was researching, I think I would sometimes go overboard because I love researching, especially because like I'm stealing everything for my own projects, where I'm just like, yoink, that goes in my pitch deck, all that kind of shit. So I would read about like a technique or something that a filmmaker used, and I'd be like, oh, God damn, now I have to research this because I want to use it for my own personal life. And so I keep all of my old scripts from Switchblade because it was actually just great research for me putting together any of my projects in the future. So it's like, for me, it was like film school, you guys. Like, I don't know if Katie felt like she learned a lot, but I felt like every episode I was learning something new. So
yeah, that's the problem when you're super passionate, is you start connecting those dots and all you want to do is like chase them. Grad school for me was very much the same way. You like read an essay and then there's like all of the cliff notes and footnotes in the back, and you're like, okay, I guess I'll just read these. And then there's all those footnotes and you're like, well, okay, I guess I'll just read these too.
Yeah. The hard part for me about that is when I would like start pulling the thread when I was in grad school, and I'd be like, oh, I need to read this article and this article. And I would inevitably find someone writing the article that I was intending to write. And I'd just like throw the book across the room and be like, fuck, I need a new idea.
Well, may I suggest starting a podcast where you only review movies with 5 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes? Because ain't nobody talking about any of these titles. So pretty much just greenfield for you. And that was my excellent segue to talk about today's film. So we're going to, because we know that probably a lot of people haven't seen this because, purpose of the show, we're going to play the trailer for y'all real quick. And when we come back, we're going to talk about, I'm going to go with the other name because I like it better, Rusalka. I'm going to talk about Rusalka.
And it should play soon.
Rusalka begins life as an ordinary young woman. But then one day, while lovesick, she drowns in a body of water. She wakes up transformed, a living ghost, a siren. And she is forever cursed with an unholy want to drown anyone who comes near her again.
All right, so that is The Siren or Rusalka. It is a 2019 horror film about two men that are vacationing, visiting, vengeancing at a lake, and the young woman in the water who may or may not be drowning the inhabitants. It is I believe, the second feature film by Perry Blackshear, who is the director of They Look Like People. And this is actually the second of 3 films, I think, in his little creative group that he has. All 3 of the main actors and Blackshear is writer-director. All work together as producers and filmmakers, and they have another film coming out, I think, in a year's time called Ogre that kind of keeps this collective together. Blackshear has described Paul Thomas Anderson as one of his inspirations, and he definitely has that like early PTA group of people in a cabin, I'm going to write for all of my friends kind of vibe. And the result, at least in this case, is The Siren. So we kind of gave you guys a list of films to choose from, and I'm kind of curious. I'm going to start with you, Katie. What was it about this one that stood out for you?
Well, I really like They Look Like People. And I had reviewed it for the LA Times in 2016 and was really struck by just the mood and tone and like what they achieve with so little, and how it just was super original to me and something I had not seen before. So I was very impressed with that film. And I had shot over to Options to April, and I think she had seen the other one. And then we decided to go with this one because we were both intrigued by it. So
do you think, just so we can get our terminology correct for the last bit of this podcast, do we call this a mermaid movie? Is this a mermaid movie? It's a Russian folklore fairy tale inspired Hans Christian Andersen-y movie, but for shorthand,
I think it's a murderous mermaid.
Yeah.
Movie. I think it fits in with like the lure and with nighttime and with all of those, right?
And Undine, which just came out.
Oh yeah.
Then I'm good. We're going to call this a mermaid movie for the rest of the conversation.
Okay.
So let's talk about an
cat hair all over my face. Can you see it? Oh my god.
Just clouds. Just clouds on the screen. Well, maybe we're going to try and start with you then, April, because I don't know if the allergies are going to kick up or not. But
it's going to be wild.
For first impressions on this one, getting a chance to watch it.
I felt like it was one of those movies where you can tell, first off, that the budget is low, but they're being really creative with the resources that they have and with the time that they have. There's just certain things that I appreciate about the movie that kind of harken back to, like the early filmmaking techniques, where there's definitely like a couple of shots where you're like, day for night, and certain things of just like using post-production techniques that make you feel a little bit off kilter, even if they seem, quote unquote, wrong in a different kind of movie that might not be genre. So I think that there's just a lot of creativity, and they're not trying to tell a story actually that's too complicated necessarily. I appreciated that, because at first I was just like, okay, there's like something that has to be explained with this person who is mute and how it happened. But I think that it was more about just a mood, like what Katie was saying. It's just like there's a certain mood and they're really riding on that. And it's like the perfect length of time. So I thought it was really quite well done.
Yeah, I grew up in Southeast Alaska, and I was drawn to the story because in Southeast Alaska, there's the legend of the Kushtaka, which is a Tlingit and Haida spirit animal that basically will go out. It was notorious for, if you were near a body of water, it would make the sound of either a woman crying or like a woman weeping or a baby crying. And as soon as you got like past the point of no return in the water, it would drag you under and drown you. So it's interesting, this is, if you read interviews with Blackshear, he talks a lot, of course, about Hans Christian Andersen. He talks a lot about Russian folklore as inspiring this. But there is, I think, a certain timeless element to this kind of mythology that you can find a version of this in a bunch of different cultures and even in a bunch of different regions here within the United States. And I think that makes it relatable in a way that, I think other types of films won't, because the mythology of this is so poorly defined, you can kind of translate it into your own local customs and folklore.
Mm-hmm.
Donato, what'd you think?
So, all right, like one of my favorite romantic horror films is Spring. I know that's not like an unpopular opinion; it's like a majority opinion. So brave, I'm not breaking the bank on that one. I know, yeah, that's not a brave statement to say, but I mean, I'm just drawn immediately to the fact that how we perceive monsters, how love can be monstrous, and all these different things. So I was immediately taken by that aspect of it, and to hit on the cinematography as well. I believe which Perry Blackshear also did, if I'm correct. I did check IMDb to be super certain, but so you have Blackshear doing so much of the work on this indie film, and it's really striking at times. And you have the scenes where the Siren is just pressed against like a little rock formation in the lake and just sitting there alone, isolated, and you really get this sense that they're making a statement about, again, how we perceive monsters and how we see these creatures and immediately as evil. And are they doing some nasty things? Yes, they might drown people. But then to actually give a personality and give characteristics and attributes, the way that they build the Siren, as we'll keep saying, the mermaid, how we do that, the Rusalka.
Thank you.
It really brought me in, and it really just kind of connected on ways that for an indie budget, for doing exactly what it did, performances, cinematography, every little detail was pretty beautiful. So that was enough for me.
Yeah, and as the film unfolds, it like you said, I think April said this. It's a pretty simple story. A guy goes to a cabin or a lake house to kind of kill some time and resolve some unresolved issues that we never really learn what they are, and we don't need to because that's not integral to the story. Just me time, general religious culty me time. But he meets this lady in the water, and the two of them are kind of being hunted by a guy whose partner was drowned, or he believes was drowned by some kind of a creature. And that's basically it. It's the man and the mermaid, and then it's kind of the murderous or potentially murderous next door neighbor and how they kind of bounce off each other in interesting ways. And it's a good, it's one of those films that I think there's an intimacy there that really comes from the fact that you believe that these people all work together a lot, right? Like there is, with the characterization, there almost feels like there's sort of a shorthand that they're able to communicate with each other, that they know exactly what needs to be explicit, what needs to be implicit. Because a lot of times with a film like this, I feel like I recognize the things that aren't being resolved. And sometimes that can bother you and sometimes it can't. And in this film, there's a lot of threads that just, they don't need to tug on because that's not really the story they set out to tell. And I think that's a testament to having a tight group of actors, a tight group of producers and collaborators, is that you can kind of find those boundaries a little bit more organically for yourselves. He said having made 0 films, but it all seems correct.
Yeah, I don't know the woman who plays the Rusalka, what her name is, but
Margaret Ying Drake is her name.
She had a lot of really lovely physical moments because so much of her performance had to be so physical. She was often really alone in shots, and there's just like a really great intimacy that you can see. There's one moment where, I don't know if I'm giving anything away, where she's kind of holding the mute man and kind of holds him underwater. But before she does it, she puts her chin onto his forehead and then just kind of like does this. And you can see that like just with like that one little head movement, like there's a lot of ideas fighting in her head of like who she's going to be and what she's going to do. And so it's just that one little head movement was actually quite terrifying. So it's just like, it's a nice thing to kind of find the horror within just these really, really thoughtful performances.
And kind of the play off that really quickly, there's another great physical moment, again, with Margaret Ying Drake, where there's a child, and there are definitely implications, whether or not they are carried through. But you have the Rusalka in front of a child, and we know the Rusalka has drowned many people. And as she's playing peekaboo with the child, gets right in her face and is reaching out her hand. And it could be the moment where she grabs a child and brings it underwater. But instead, the child just high fives her and her face kind of lights up. And she goes from that scary, shadowy figure, because again, cinematography is painting her completely black. We don't really see her. But all of a sudden, then the high five illuminates her. And she is, again, we see her as a normal person, you know, quote unquote, as we would. And her face is just so full of like a second of joy. And then it goes right back to the horror because she is just imprisoned in this form. And it's a testament to what you've just been saying, April, in the sense that like this actress is bringing so much to a role that could have been a stereotypical monster, but we have these human characteristics coming out that we can connect with and relate with. And immediately that facade of a monster just falls away.
Yeah, one of the things I love about this film is her performance kind of as a foil to the two men in a way. Like there is an element of playfulness, and tonally it's a little bit different, even though she is also a monster. And I think that sort of, it kind of puts you off balance a little bit with her. I was also watching this movie and I'm like, I like her life. Like she's got her little trinkets. She's swimming around. She's drowning men. I was like, I want what she has. Like, I was weirdly appealed by her. I found her life very appealing.
Wow, I did not realize this was like a Rorschach test.
I was like, this looks kind of cool.
I was like, oh, that's sad. And Katie's like, hell yeah, all right, I'm moving in.
She's got a little rock where she puts her little trinkets, and it looked cool.
Damn.
But that also is like totally what I did my entire childhood. So
drown people at a lake in upstate.
Wait, yeah. Clarify.
No,
there's a lot of unsolved murders. You check out her hometown off of St. Croix. Totally.
I grew up in the Virgin Islands in St. Croix, and I grew up swimming in the ocean and like collecting weird little shells and rocks and playing games with them, just like being a water child. So I don't know. It looked good to me. But lakes, I don't fuck with lakes. I don't want to get in a lake. Those freak me out. I only swim in the ocean.
Yeah, sitting water is evil.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask, because we were talking a little bit about Tom earlier, who's the main character, and he is mute, but it's not something that the film is processing. It's just his state of being. He is mute. And I'm curious what y'all thought of kind of the way that they worked that into the story, because I feel like horror in particular over the last few years has had a lot of really good conversations about the way the disabilities are portrayed in film. And, you know, if it's empowering, if it's regressive, if it's exploitative. I thought that this added a lot to the character, but I'm curious where y'all landed with this, and if you felt that it was a good idea to add a little bit of complexity, if it was something that they didn't really think through all the way to the end. Just thoughts on that.
I really liked that you have this myth that is about a woman or a creature, a siren, a rusalka, who typically is known to sing or lure people with her voice. And on the soundtrack, you do get some of these, you know, a woman singing and kind of hints at that. And then to have a main character who she seduces who does not have a voice, and how he works around that and their relationship. And I thought that was just like a really interesting sort of symbolic way to approach this this myth that many people know. And what I do really like about this film is that it is taking sort of a familiar mythological character and a familiar genre, and then kind of turning it upside down and saying, oh, this is a romance, and we're going to explore what that looks like. And here's this monster who we could see as monstrous, but also we see her as in love and as sexual. And like, how does that make us feel about her? And how does that make us feel about him? So I thought it was an interesting choice to do that. And I also love that the way that Evan Dumoshel, who plays Tom, you know, the way that he plays it is just like, yep, can't talk. And he, you know, it doesn't seem to limit him in any way, except for the scene where the phone is ringing and he can't answer.
Well, they have that great shot at the very beginning where he has the wristband and it says, I'm mute, and then flips it over, but I can hear. I thought that was a nice touch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's nice that they're kind of flipping things on the head. Like if you think to like The Little Mermaid and the idea that like someone loses their voice, like it's part of the mythology. It's just a little bit rearranged. There's someone who's a little bit weaker in this situation. So I appreciate it for that, I think.
And Katie, you had mentioned earlier talking about, the mermaid character, the way that she gets to be kind of a sexual creature. I think one of the things that I was not prepared for with this film is that this is actually one of the hornier horror films I feel like I've seen in a minute. And and I mean that as a compliment. Like it has two sexually charged characters that has really good chemistry. It finds new and interesting ways of kind of bringing them physically into contact with each other without actually, resorting to any kind of the explicit stuff that sometimes films of this budget feel they need to throw into the mix. So we are used to, Donata, you had mentioned Spring earlier. We're used to like a lot of these kind of love stories. I kind of feel like in horror, we don't necessarily get, again, I'll say horror as horny as this one did. So I'm going to throw it out to anybody who wants to talk about the horniness of Rusalka. You're more than welcome to jump in right here.
Well, I was at the end of this movie, I was like, they just wanted to get Evan's shirt off. Like the amount of times they had him like stripping down. And I'm like, I mean, he's a hot guy. And I think that what's also interesting though, is I felt a lot of those scenes were like her fantasy of like what she's imagining they're going to do. And so it's this like horniness from the perspective of the mermaid. And I think that was really cool and interesting because she's like, yeah, that guy, I'm not going to drown him. I'm going to fuck him.
But like she's always wearing a dress too, and like that, I just even more your counterbalance there, where Evan is shirtless and basically just in his underwear for part of the film, and she's in a full dress and just swimming around. Right. So the objectification is flipped completely, and we don't have that typical mermaid look, I guess I would say, like quote quote. But yeah, they dance around that, and I think Monocle, to say that it is a horny movie, you're 100% correct. But like, it's not like Bow Chicka Wow Wow horny. It's like there's a woman's choir.
That's the critical term. That's correct.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a woman's choir the entire time because we do have a mute character, so we don't get a lot of dialogue in these scenes. The Rusalka tries to talk to Tom, and Tom just immediately is just like, can't do it. So we don't have a lot of exchange there. So we get quiet scenes. We get muted scenes, but the woman's choir overlaid atop, it just becomes this like little slow crescendo, and it's never overt and it's never, again, objectifying. It is just this coming together of two people, creatures, whatever you want to call it. And again, I'll use the word like beautiful, like the shimmering of the lake and the sunlight and everything hitting it. It is a really deep romance.
I think you're right in terms of like it being maybe more of an intimate movie than it is lustful, and that intimacy is kind of heightened by the camera work being so close to these actors, and that these actors, I mean, the fact that they had made another movie together or several is not surprising to me, because they have the kind of closeness of a theater troupe in the way that like you can kind of throw any actor into that situation and they feel physically comfortable there, because so often you have actors who've never met each other who have to like form relationships, and then things feel almost like campy and unreal, because they're so like a play of someone who's falling in love, or someone who's like in a romantic relationship. Whereas these actors, I can feel immediately that intimacy that they have together, and I just appreciate that. That's the kind of intimacy that you get when you have to like have like do like a Blue Valentine, like extreme experiment, where you just like force people to live together to become intimate, so that like their sex scenes seem real, and there are great actors who can transcend that, but physical intimacy is one of the more difficult things to do convincing on a screen. Like it is a really hard thing. And sometimes I think actors shy away from sex scenes because of that, not even just because of nudity, though that has its own trappings, but because it's its own form of separate acting that is really, really hard to achieve. But these characters, I think, are just really great. They seem so comfortable with each other, so.
Yeah, and I think like going back to the intimacy comment, it's like I think one of the most compelling images for me was like the two of them waking up or sleeping next to each other, and that kind of like it connotes like lovers waking up together and like the coziness of that. And that was something that I was like, oh, that's so lovely. And that was the thing that kind of, it's not about, bow chicka wow wow, if you will. It's about the moments that they share.
Well,
I'm glad that's an audio clip forever.
You need that too, because you're basically, I mean, everybody knows, if you've seen Beauty and the Beast style stories that's being flipped, everybody knows that there's going to be this pull and they're going to end up together, or at least like try and consummate their love. And I think that's those little moments that you talk about, April and Katie, are so integral to making that work, because, you have to believe there has to be a moment where Tom finds out. And there is that moment where Tom finds out and he has to stay, and you have to buy him staying, and you have to believe that that his reasons for staying are deeper than just sexual attraction. And by pulling all of these little instances, these little flashbacks, these little fantasies that she has together, you're able to do the thing that everybody knows you have to do in order to make this central couple work, and pull it off in a way that actually feels authentic and lived in. And that's, if you have good actors and you see it on screen and it works, you're like, oh, that's great. That's a compelling love story. But we have all seen many, many, many movies where they go for that moment and you're like, why are you still here? Like, this is not, you haven't earned this reveal. We all knew it was coming. So it's a credit when people that are working with a smaller budget or working with, less well-known actors are able to pull off those moments that you see coming, and you're like, all right, you earned it. I'm right here with you. Yep. He's definitely going to go back to her. Yeah.
And that's why a movie like The Siren, talking about Indy specifically, there's nothing else to rely on outside of that chemistry, that dynamic. And this is all a character piece. This is all on the characters. We don't have massive set pieces or practical effects that would be on like a blockbuster level or anything of that nature. And I feel like that's what makes indie filmmaking so much harder, because when you have the money, you can throw a bunch of things on screen and it will distract from negatives, or we'll call them in a way. Like, it will distract from the things that might take us out of the film, where an indie movie is relying so much on the characters, so much on the performers, and they're doing so much more of the heavy lifting, that I feel like it actually gets more credit in that sense. And when you see performances like these, it just elevates a film like all the way up here, because we realize how integral these performances are to film, and maybe other films kind of lessen the performances, and like that kind of sucks in that way. So I very much connected The Midnight Swim to The Siren in ways, talking about intimacy and things of that nature, because Sarah Dina Smith does amazing things with the camera work, and that's about more exploring the water, and it's about sisterhood and things of that nature, but still you have the intimacy of going into the water with the characters. And April said before, it's like the camera's right in your face, right in the character's face, so you don't have anywhere else to go. You just have your characters and performers. And when they can carry a film like they do, it just becomes all the more impressive.
I mean, you don't even have pages of dialogue, really. You have these like one-sided conversations that you have three main characters and one of them doesn't ever talk. So I thought Evan Dumochel was great. Like, that guy's a movie star. And, I'm glad to see him working with Perry Blackshear and the troupe that they have, McLeod Andrews.
Mm-hmm.
How do you say his name? But because they do have the shorthand, and they are, and those guys were the leads, and they look like people, and they play friends, and one is having like potentially a mental breakdown, and they obviously have like a very shared history in their performances and their creative adventures together. So it's nice to see them together. And I thought McLeod was really great too. I mean, he's sort of you have this crazy love story happening, and then you have the guy who's like, wait, she drowned my husband, and I'm really upset about that. And he's like not only the realistic part, but he brings like a darker element of revenge and of grief, and it becomes a film that's really about it's about love, but it's also about grief, and it's about how those things affect people and what they're going to do with their grief or what they're going to do with their love. And like, what I thought was really interesting about They Look Like People is like, and this film as well, is like, it's the horror within, right? It's not the external threat. It's more about what we're thinking, what we're doing, are you a danger to me because of what's going on in your head? And that's kind of mirrored in this film as well, but it's also a monster movie. So I think like applying that to a mythological monster movie is a really interesting approach to what this movie is, a mermaid movie.
Yeah, and on Certified Forgotten, we always like to kind of talk about the rediscovery process, right? Because films like this there are dozens of really, really quality horror film festivals across the United States, and they are playing dozens of really, really good horror movies every single year. And distribution, opportunities for these films to actually find their audiences are limited. So the question that I have for you all, especially as people that have been in varying degrees on the other side of this from an industry standpoint, is where does Rusalka, where does the Siren find its audience? How does this film, and it's not a difficult film to find. It's available on Shudder, so it's in the places that horror fans typically think to look at for good horror movies. But what allows something like this to kind of cross over and gain that word of mouth or that cult following that it missed on its initial release?
That's a hard question.
It is, but we're not holding you to the answers. We're not going
Right.
to tell the filmmakers how to solve their problems. So you're good on that front.
I mean, like, I think grouping it with more mermaid movies, or if you like this, then you might like this kind of thing. But also I think just like obviously the Black Shear group or whatever their troupe is called, like they are slowly building this body of work that I think is really interesting. I think is really pushing the boundaries of indie horror filmmaking and even the genre boundaries. And so I think they look like people got probably more attention, obviously more attention than this. So it's one of those things where it's like, this is the same vibe. Like go out and seek this out. If you liked this, then like watch their follow-up. And if their third movie is also, in this vein, I mean, it's one of those things that it's like, okay, you have to watch the trilogy. Like this is a thematic piece. Cause I really did feel like the two films were talking about the same thing.
The log line for the third film, by the way, is that a group a pair of siblings grow up and wreak revenge on the childhood monster that frightened them as kids, which seems like pretty much part and parcel for some of the stuff we've seen going on in Black Shear's mind so far.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's weird. Matt was talking. One of the Matts was talking about it, and I'm just going to say that. Maybe it was Donato. I can't remember about the not knowing that many romantic things. Oh yeah, because you said spring was so not knowing much like romantic horror, and I think that there is a reason for that, and I think that the reason for that is that when it comes to horror, we very often cater to a very specific audience. And we've been doing it for so long that I think it sometimes has a stranglehold on the genre at times, because there's only certain things that will kind of break through. And I do think that a movie like this doesn't hit all of the usual marks that you would get for that midnight crowd who's just like, yeah, horror movies, this is my thing. I love it. Blood, gore. And then it's just like, actually, this is just like a really thoughtful, like intense emotional journey of a mermaid. And it's really hard to kind of convince those people. I feel like for a movie like this to break through, you do have to do quite a bit of word of mouth. To people who are more genre adjacent, because sometimes like the hardcore thing, like, will miss these little gems, I think, because of, like calling it romantic. Even if that's something that we might like, it might be something like, oh, we'll just skip it at the film festival. We'll go to something else. It's hard, but like you do have to group it with other mermaid movies. But if you think about other mermaid movies, it's just like, okay, how did the lure break through? Well, the lure, the fucking Polish disco masterpiece. Like, you know, how did that break through? You know, like this is quiet, and you know, it's always going to be harder to break those quiet films. So you really do require word of mouth, and you know, like a podcast like yours, kind of like catching people up on what it is. Eventually, people are going to catch on to what Blackshear is doing, and they'll be like, "Oh, I'll have to search that out." But then the people in the know will be like, "Oh, well, have you heard of Rusalka? I'm sorry, you might know it as the Siren."
I do think you make a good point about getting in the genre adjacent crowd. Like my mom, obviously, I mentioned my mom doesn't like horror. And actually last winter when I was at home, we kind of had a breakthrough. We watched some stuff together, but she was obsessed with La Llorona, the Guatemalan film, which is based on the La Llorona myth. And she was like, that's not a horror movie. That's not a horror movie. I was like, it is. It's a ghost movie. She's a ghost. And she's like, well, I don't think that's a horror movie. And she has a very limited view of what horror movies are. She thinks it's like chainsaws and like blood spurting. And I think she'd like this movie. And I think that there are people who say, oh, horror's not for me, but they don't realize how expansive of a genre it can be. And I think that there are a lot of non-horror people who would really dig what Blackshear's doing because it's so genre defying. And I also think it appeals to genre fans. And then they're like these psychological mysteries and sort of emotional interpersonal relationship thrillers. So I think that picking up in the genre adjacent people and kind of reeling them in that way is possibly a way to go.
Yeah, I'm glad that Donato had mentioned The Midnight Swim too, because that movie I think is often underseen. I'm glad that people loved Buster's Malhart. You know, she had a bigger star for that. But The Midnight Swim is in one of those adjacent things where she creates a mood. It's not horror, but there's a mood to it that feels kind of like dread a little bit, you know, and so she's creating that. And so I think that it was kind of picked up by some genre people because they're like, oh, I can vibe with this. But it's also a crossover one that I think was just doing well on the indie circuit in general, like outside of genre spheres. But there's, hopefully there are people who are kind of like willing to take a chance on those types of movies though.
Yeah, and I mean, there definitely is the preconception that horror is the horror I know. It is the slasher, killy, gross out. It's what my mom thinks horror is every time I go home. And she's like, why do you still watch those gross movies? I'm like, because most of them are kind of beautiful and like the gross ones, blah, blah, blah. But that is very alive because if you go on Shudder, and I love Shudder, God bless Shudder, but sometimes reading the comments on people rating what they've watched is a little infuriating because if you read the comments here, it's a bunch of 1 star saying this isn't horror, take it off Shudder. Like it's people being confused because they don't see this as horror, they don't see it as anything scary in that nature, and it's not the horror they've grown up on. So they immediately cast it out because it's different. And if we want to talk about romance and horror, I mean, Bride of Frankenstein is literally a Universal Monster classic that has inspired so many films after it, and it has inspired Bride of Chucky, which is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. And that is very much based around romance in certain ways.
Also very romantic.
Exactly. Right. So exactly. That is based around romance and very romantic if you like Martha Stewart and things like that. But the fact that we can't get more people to like really hop on the romance and horror bandwagon is a little frustrating, and that makes it harder to sell because, as both of you pointed out, that subset of horror who just want their slashers the way that they used to be are never going to come on to something like The Siren. It is quieter. It is. I really hope the Perry Blackshear troupe, as we'll call them, get their kind of Benson and Moorhead moment where I do see a lot of similarities here where they're both in, you know, one of those troops has very much taken off and very much is doing much bigger things, and deservedly so. I love their movies. I'm in love with Benson Moorhead and what they do. But I think there's a correlation here, and there's a correlation in the way that they both started. And I think it's just sheer product at this point. Blackshear is just working on a little bit smaller scale and making films that aren't as marketable in a way, but that's not a bad thing. And they're just going to be going on streaming. They're just going to be doing these things, and they're going to have to find their space amongst the recommendations. And I always try to sandwich things. So again, me saying, here's The Siren and Spring, watch them together, try to get people in the same vein. I really do think The Midnight Swim make a great watch with this. And there's just like other little movies out there you can tie it into. And it might get someone more interested, because if you explain the Siren at face value, yeah, it sounds not like everyone's speed, and it won't.
God forbid you look at that poster image before you see anything else about the film too. That is that's an abomination.
And also, the Rusalka is a more interesting name to me. The Siren, I've seen films called The Siren and The Siren and things of that nature. We all have an idea of what a siren is in our head. I see the Rusalka and I'm like, that is a creature I'm not familiar with yet. And I'm sure it is adjacent, and it is Siren adjacent, but it just gives a little more definition. And I know the business reasons why they went with the Siren. Do not get me wrong. I know exactly why that happened, but it just had some things working against it. And the Rusalka actually closed out the very first Brooklyn Horror Film Festival that I was working at. And just what you guys were saying, it was our closing movie. And I forget if it was sold out or not, but it just kind of came and went. And it just kind of didn't have a lot of buzz because everyone went in wanting that closing night to be something bigger, I think. And there were the people that loved it, but you just kind of didn't hear anything afterwards. And that sucked. It just sucked to have this new movie that is so beautiful and put it on that stage. And, the programmers and stuff did a tremendous job programming it. And then it just kind of fades away into the wind. And it's that reappraisal period. I wish it was easier, I guess.
It's coming for Black Shearer.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add to that, is just that I think now is a really, really good time for a film like this to be rediscovered. What was the Jeremy Gardner film that came out last year, After Midnight?
After Midnight. Yep. Hair that. Oh, love After
Midnight. I
I
think in terms of timing, the timing of this film's release was terrible. But right now, with everybody kind of tentatively coming out of COVID, with people having to relearn and reform human connections for the first time in 14 months, a film like this that is dealing with concepts of isolation and existential loss of self-identity and finding romance with all of these things pushed up against it. This is a great, for those that are writing listicles, this is a great post-COVID horror film or dark fantasy or dark romance, whatever you want to call it. So I hope that as people start to think about what are some movies that could be inadvertently good reflections of the period that we've all had to live through, this to me feels like one of those movies that in 20 years, and Donato knows that this is my only criteria for if a film is good or not. In 20 years, some college senior is going to write an amazing essay about this period in horror and how it reflected social anxiety of the pandemic and whatnot. And yeah, they're going to lump Rusalka in there, and it's going to be a perfect combination with everything else because it really fits that bill nicely.
Here's hoping.
I got my fingers crossed. I can wait 20 years.
Yeah.
All right.
You're going to be yes, vindicated.
Monaco was right.
I got to hurry up and have a kid so he can be the one to write that.
Yeah. Just start showing it to your kid from do the April's grandpa. Do the April's grandpa raise. It worked.
All I know is that I'm gonna have kids that are just gonna be watching this movie constantly, and you're going to retire to upstate New York and drown people because it seems cozy.
I can't wait.
I love it. Well, that is the end of this particular show. I want to thank you both. Honestly, we've been talking about having each of you on individually for a very, very long time, and the fact that the stars worked out just right to get you both on the show together is incredible. Here at the end, please take an opportunity to promote anything upcoming or social media handles or just things you're not involved in but you feel like could use a little bit more attention. Take a minute for yourselves. What do you want to hype?
Well, my Twitter handle is Katie Walsh STX. I share all my reviews there. All my reviews are on Rotten Tomatoes. Don't think I have anything specific to talk about coming out just yet, but that's where I put all my reviews and all my hot takes. So.
You recently wrote a really good piece for GQ on Fast and Furious.
Yes, I did. I posted a hot take on Twitter about Too Fast, Too Furious. And it caused an uproar. And then an editor from GQ was like, hey, do you want to write this as a piece? And so I wrote a defense of Too Fast, Too Furious because I think it is a very good movie. I think it's better than the first one. So that's one instance where posting your hot takes, positive hot takes, can really work in your advantage. And that's all I'm posting. I'm not posting any negative hot takes these days, only positive ones, because otherwise I get into too much trouble. But yeah, it worked out. I'm watching the 8th Fast and Furious movie tonight, so I'm very excited about that. I'm very fast saturated right now.
going to be a nice bit of whiplash between this and that. Should be fun.
I know. Yeah, it was a good little like cooling off moment for me.
April, I know that you announced on Twitter that you're probably stepping away from festival stuff and other things like that for the foreseeable future as you work to push some stuff across the finish line. But if folks do want to figure out, like something, right? Back episodes of Switchblade Sisters or follow you on social media, what's the best places to reach out?
Definitely check out the back catalog of Switchblade Sisters, which is, it's evergreen. So everyone is kind of like a little film course you can take. And they can follow me on Twitter, although I'm not sure why you would want to.
You're a great source of LA politics. LA politics that's one of the things I've learned from you and following you is just the ins and outs of the city.
Yeah, it's just like, if you don't care about LA or the Dodgers.
I was going to say Dodgers tweets.
Yeah, there's a lot of Dodgers tweets that just come out of the middle of nowhere. So, if you don't care about those things, it's not really a reason to follow me, I guess. But outside of that, I that's probably where I'll be announcing any of the new projects that I have that are in those phases where you're not allowed to talk about anything, which is always extremely frustrating. So, yeah.
That's a stay tuned.
Yeah,
exactly.
Stay tuned.
Mm-hmm. Donato, real quick, where do people follow you, talk to you?
At Donatobomb, as you see right below. Letterboxd, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also live stream with me and Perry Nemiroff every Friday. I write all the things. I do all the things. I'll post all my hard takes and things you guys want to hear on the socials. So just follow that along. Rotten Tomatoes, as Katie said before, I'm there too. So I don't know. Just like Google my name or something.
As for myself, you can follow me at LabSplice, which is here. And do please check out CertifiedForgotten.com. We have gotten into a really good groove with a lot of really good writers. Please read Katie's piece on Carrie. It is kick-ass. It's one of my favorite pieces that we've published. Whatever the direction is, I'm just generally pointing. Follow us on the podcast. You can search Certified Forgotten in all the places that you normally would find podcasts. We promise that eventually, through sheer happenstance, we'll dig up a 5 review or less movie that you really, really love, and we'll talk about that. So we're excited for when that day happens. But otherwise, again, April and Katie, thank you so much for joining us on the show. And we hope that everybody that is listening is taking advantage of all the other awesome programming that they have at North Bend this year. There's a lot of really good films, a lot of really good podcasts, and a couple of really good panels, one of which may include somebody who's in this room as well. So just throwing that out there.
Oh.
Do you want to bump that real quick before we go?
Yeah.
I gotcha.
That's right. I'm talking with Richard Kelly for the Donnie Darko anniversary screening, and he's just such a delightful person that you can learn so much from. It's a great conversation as he's done so many interviews. But he's great. So definitely check that out.
Do you know if there's going to be a recording of that available afterwards, or is it just they got to buy tickets and do it live?
That's a super good question. But I have imagined that there's probably going to be a recording of it afterwards.
Follow North Bend on Twitter, and they will let you know that pretty soon, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, because I recorded it same day, so it just happened. So
the onus is on them. All right. Well, thank you all, and everybody else.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.
And end broadcast.
And that's that.